Bonsoir, vous m'entendez? Voilà. Bienvenue à cette soirée, cet échange autour des mystères de la créativité, un dialogue entre artistes et neuroscientifiques. J'ai le grand plaisir d'animer cette soirée entre Idan Segev et Metin Arditi. Et vous allez voir que non seulement ça va être un dialogue entre neurosciences, artistes, créativité, mais également un dialogue en français et en anglais, puisque chacun de nos conférenciers parlera dans sa langue. Alors, on va basculer, je basculerai du français à l'anglais. Donc, ça sera un dialogue en deux langues. Je me présente peut-être brièvement, je m'appelle Stéphane Eliège, je suis pédopsychiatre, je fais aussi des recherches en neurosciences, tout particulièrement dans le développement des maladies du développement, l'autisme et la psychose. Je travaille aussi comme directeur de l'office médico-pédagogique qui s'occupe de psychiatrie de l'enfant et de l'adolescent dans le canton, ainsi que de l'enseignement spécialisé. J'aimerais remercier pour commencer tout d'abord l'Université de Genève qui nous accueille ici, son recteur, M. Yves Flukiger, qui a rendu cet événement possible, toute l'équipe de communication de l'Université de Genève, ainsi que toute l'équipe de soutien attachée à l'Université hébraïque de Jérusalem, et notamment Mme Bougnone. Quelques mots pour vous présenter aussi l'Université hébraïque de Jérusalem, qui est co-sponsor de cet événement. L'Université hébraïque a été créée en 1918 avec des fondateurs illustres tels que Albert Einstein, Martin Buber, Sigmund Freud, Chaim Weizmann. Elle a compté 8 prix Nobel. Elle est rankée ou classée dans le top 100 des meilleures universités au monde, avec vraiment des domaines d'expertise dans les sciences sociales, dans les humanités, dans les neurosciences, les sciences exactes, la médecine. Et elle a typiquement une politique d'intégration à l'image de ce qui se fait aussi à Genève, multidisciplinaire, entre les différentes facultés. Elle a une politique de liens forts entre la recherche académique, le monde des sciences sociales et les applications industrielles. J'aimerais aussi profiter de remercier les amis de Swiss Friends of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem Association, et nous avons la chance d'avoir avec nous la présidente suisse, Gültin Efrati, qui est aussi présidente européenne depuis peu. Voilà. J'aimerais présenter notre premier intervenant ce soir, Metin Arditi. Metin Arditi est né en Turquie. Il est arrivé en Suisse à l'âge de 7 ans. Il a commencé sa vie en Suisse comme résident d'une des écoles de la côte, où il a suivi toute sa scolarité. Il a ensuite été à l'école, l'EPFL, où il a étudié la physique nucléaire, et il a poursuivi ses études aux États-Unis par un MBA à Stanford. Il a fait sa carrière professionnelle et très vite est entré dans l'activité culturelle, les activités culturelles genevoises. Il a été président d'un des enfants chéris de la culture genevoise, l'Orchestre de la Suisse romande, et il est impliqué dans de nombreuses autres activités culturelles. Il a une activité d'écriture romanesque importante. Il approche des 20 romans et essais aujourd'hui. Il est auteur de très nombreux prix pour ses romans et ses essais. Vous avez connaissez certainement quelques titres. Dans les titres que je citerai, La dernière lettre à Théo, La pension Marguerite, ou encore La fille des Louganis, Le Turquetto, et récemment Juliette dans son bain. I'm Also pleased to introduce our second speaker, Idan Sedev. He's a professor in computational neuroscience. He might explain us what this is. He's a member of the Edmond and Lily Safra Center of Brain Science, and he's the head of the Department of Neurobiology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's an outstanding researcher. You might not be familiar with those magazines, those scientific magazines, but he's publishing in the very best, among which Science, Nature, PNAS. He's also the chief editor of Frontiers in Neuroscience. His research is very basic neuroscience research. He works at the very core of understanding plastic capabilities of cortical neurons, how they build themselves, how they elaborate their morphology, and how they interact at the level of microcircuit, at the level of the cortex. But beyond that, Idan Segev has also a very special interest in the connection between art and the brain. He has co-edited a book, an artist book, with original brain-inspired drawings with many Israeli artists. So, as you see, we have a very complementary panel. So, la première question que j'aimerais poser à Metin Arditi, c'est pourquoi d'abord il est tellement fasciné dans son œuvre par la création. La moitié de ses livres, au moins, ont pour thème central la création. Il s'est directement intéressé à des artistes en particulier, que ce soit Nietzsche ou encore Van Gogh, à qui il a quand même consacré 2 ouvrages, un roman, un essai. Et la plupart de ses livres parlent de peinture, de composition, d'artistes, de musiciens ou encore d'écrivains. Metin.
Bon, en réalité, moi, je suis vraiment ici plus pour apprendre que pour dire, parce que je me trouve régulièrement devant des interrogations pour lesquelles je n'ai pas de réponse. C'est vrai, j'ai essayé de suivre Van Gogh, de comprendre Nietzsche. Je les retrouve régulièrement dans mes textes romanesques. Mais c'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, surtout, je suis probablement dans cette salle un de ceux qui est le plus impatient et intéressé à écouter ce que va nous dire Idan. Pourquoi ? J'ai essayé de dresser un panorama des situations dans lesquelles je me retrouve régulièrement. Elles sont de 3 natures. Et je vais donner dans chaque cas un exemple. Le premier cas de figure, ce sont des histoires, donc des constructions narratives imaginées en lien direct avec ce qu'on appelle la raison ou le conscient. Par exemple, dans l'un de mes romans, qui s'appelle Loin des bras, je raconte l'histoire d'Irène Kowalski et de son mari, un mathématicien allemand qu'elle connaît à Paris, Karl Kowalski, au début des années 30. Karl Kowalski retourne en Allemagne et se retrouve marié avec Irène à Peenemünde, c'est-à-dire tout au nord, au bord de la Baltique, là où les nazis développaient les fusées V1 et V2. il s'ennuie avec d'autres mathématiciens et un jour qu'elle va faire un voyage à Paris, Irène Kowalski leur ramène, pour qu'ils passent leur temps, un petit jeu de roulette. Et voilà qu'ils se mettent à jouer entre eux, et j'imagine qu'à ce moment-là, Karl Kowalski invente une technique que j'ai utilisée quand j'étais physicien, qui s'appelle la méthode de Monte-Carlo, qui génère des nombres au hasard, qui permet de simuler des phénomènes trop complexes pour être mis en équation. Alors j'imagine que la méthode de Monte-Carlo est due à lui. Le temps passe, elle les écoute quand ils jouent, ils s'amusent entre eux, elle les écoute dire en français, parce qu'il faut le dire en français, mais avec leur accent allemand, « faites vos cheux, rien ne va plus », etc. Ça la marque. Des années plus tard, il est décédé, Irène Kowalski se retrouve à accompagner la maman d'un élève. Elle travaille dans une école privée en Suisse romande, elle accompagne la maman d'une élève à Divonne. Cette maman va de temps en temps jouer à la roulette quelques sous, 3 sous, rien de grave. Mais quand Irène Kowalski écoute les croupiers dire « faites vos jeux, rien ne va plus », alors là, évidemment, le monde s'écroule, et puis elle retourne, elle est bouleversée. Elle retourne parce qu'elle recherche son mari et elle se met à jouer, et puis au fil de l'histoire, elle se ruine. Ça, c'est un exemple où l'histoire a été inventée, mais elle est en lien direct avec des informations qui proviennent vraiment de mon conscient. J'ai travaillé à la méthode de Monte-Carlo et j'ai étudié évidemment les questions liées à la roulette, etc. Dans cette histoire, on peut dire qu'il y a relativement peu qui est inventé, si ce n'est que c'est quand même une histoire elle-même inventée de toutes pièces. Il y a des histoires qui sont imaginées sans un lien évident avec le conscient, mais dont je comprends par la suite le lien avec le subconscient. Je ne sais pas là ce qui se passe, et je suis très intéressé de savoir ce qui se passe, et je vais donner un exemple. Je le racontais tout à l'heure à Idan. J'ai écrit de 1910 à 1912 un roman intitulé Prince d'orchestre. C'est un roman très dur, c'est un roman dans lequel je n'ai fait strictement aucune concession dans ma description du monde de la grande musique symphonique. J'étais à l'époque président de l'orchestre de la Suisse romande. J'ai donné du monde symphonique une description d'une cruauté absolue, ce qui n'était pas, entre parenthèses, la meilleure des idées sur le plan commercial. C'est parce que le grand public aime lire, mais je l'ai fait sans hésiter. Et j'ai compris une année après avoir sorti le livre, au moment où j'ai démissionné de ma présidence d'orchestre parce que je voulais passer plus de temps à l'écriture, parce que j'avais été nommé à l'UNESCO, etc., j'ai compris alors de façon absolument claire que j'ai écrit ce livre pour me convaincre qu'il fallait quitter le monde de la musique classique. C'était une façon pour moi de me mettre à la porte, en quelque sorte. Et puis il y a un troisième type de situation dans lequel, alors là vraiment, je ne comprends plus rien. Donc il y a une sorte de crescendo dans mon incompréhension entre le premier cas de figure où il y a un lien entre la création et la raison, un deuxième cas de figure où il y a un lien compris par la suite entre la création et le subconscient, et puis il y a un troisième cas de figure où je ne comprends vraiment plus. Et je donne un exemple. J'étais en train d'écrire, j'ai plusieurs exemples, mais je vais en donner un seul. pas monopolisé. J'étais en train d'écrire Loin des bras. Et c'était l'été, sur la petite île où nous avons une maison à Spetses. Ma femme me dit un jour, écoute, nos voisins nous proposent d'aller manger un poisson ce soir. Alors, nos voisins, c'est des gens que j'aime beaucoup, et chaque année, on fait au moins 1 ou 2 dîners ensemble dans le petit bistrot au bord de l'eau qui est juste devant nos maisons. Et c'est des moments que j'adore. Et je dis à ma femme, écoute, s'il te plaît, rien, pas ce soir, je suis dans tous mes états. Pourquoi est-ce que j'étais dans tous mes états? Parce que je décrivais un instant de la vie d'un personnage qui s'appelle Vera, cette femme qui était professeure d'italien dans un internat du bord du lac. Cette femme avait perdu son fils de 12 ans. Elle était dans cet internat, elle participait à ce qu'on appelait alors les cours de danse. C'est-à-dire qu'une fois par semaine, les élèves recevaient, il y avait des jeunes filles qui venaient d'un pensionnat de jeunes filles, et puis les garçons et les filles apprenaient à danser pendant 1 heure chaque semaine, le mercredi soir, de 8 à 9. Et j'étais en train d'écrire l'instant, et Vera avait... Il se passait quelque chose avec un de ses élèves de la classe d'italien. C'était un garçon brillant, de 18 ans, très beau, qui l'a malmené un petit peu. Et elle était fascinée par ce garçon. Et au moment où ma femme m'a posé cette question, j'étais en train de décrire ce que moi je considérais comme l'instant de bascule de cette femme dans la consolation. C'est-à-dire que le maître de danse mettait un disque. Ce disque, c'est une chanson que tout le monde connaît qui s'appelle Brasil, qui est très rythmée. Et il mettait une version à la trompette. Et Vera était assise sur sa chaise, elle ne dansait pas à cet instant, elle avait les jambes croisées. Et je décris tout à coup cette femme qui était dans le malheur le plus profond qu'on puisse imaginer et qui commence du bout de son pied à rythmer la musique. Elle était en train, et plus tard dans la scène, elle allait se lever et elle allait danser avec ce garçon. Et ensuite, elle allait s'enfuir, enfin, il y a tout un développement. Mais à cet instant-là, où le maître de danse a mis cette musique, elle était en train de taper du pied. J'étais en train de décrire cela, et quand ma femme m'a demandé d'aller dîner avec nos amis. J'ai continué mon travail jusque tard le soir. C'était 9h30, 10h, et là je n'en pouvais plus, j'étais épuisé émotionnellement, et j'ai demandé à ma femme d'appeler nos amis pour leur demander si par miracle ils étaient encore disponibles pour aller dîner. On dîne tard en Grèce, c'était l'été, voilà. Ils l'étaient. On va dîner, on s'assied, et à un moment donné, il y a le mari de nos amis qui dit « Je vous demande pardon, mais je dois aller chercher la belle-sœur de ma femme. Elle arrive au port avec l'hydroglisseur venant d'Athènes et je la ramène. » Il se lève, il part, et au moment où il part, notre amie, sa femme, nous raconte que sa belle-sœur a vécu un drame, qu'elle a perdu un enfant et qu'elle s'est consolée dans les bras d'un garçon beaucoup plus jeune qu'elle.
Idan, Metin is telling us about the process of creation that is so complex. There is emotion, there is a lot of mental imagery, there is also memory, a lot of memory, and it was very interesting in describing the act of creation, how he's, in a way, re-experiencing his own episodes of life and projects them into a character. Is there any chance that neuroscience can explain something as complex? And what comes into it?
I wanted to say no, but I'm a scientist, so I should say yes, because in principle we feel as scientists we are megalomaniac. We are megalomaniac. Being a scientist really means that you want to understand basically everything, and you believe that you can understand everything in physics or in neuroscience, and. In principle, I think, because as I see the brain, I see it's a machine built from a particular elements that I study a lot, and I'm trying to understand the mechanistic aspect of the brain. So in principle, and the question is, what does it mean to understand? When will I say that I understood the brain of Metin? And my answer will be that I will be able to build a machine based on principles that I've learned from the real brain, and this machine will be able to write the romance or have the ideas and emotions of Metin or of you, of myself. Of course, this machine will be unique. We shall maybe discuss later about the effect of environment on this machine, and so it's not only built from within, so the genome, but also from the environment. But in principle, yes. He is a machine, I'm a machine, you're a machine, and as a scientist I should be able to explain basically everything. Explain meaning building a machine from first principles that will generate the same phenomena as the machine I want to replicate. So my answer is in principle yes. Still we are extremely far, very far from achieving it, because some basic principles about brain research is not known. We don't understand the fundamental principles about the operation, the mechanistic aspect of the operation of this machine. How do I stand and speak now? Why do I feel? How do I feel feelings? And there are a lot of gaps. But in principle, the answer to your question is yes. And within this question, I would say that the most fascinating aspect is creativity. So we are very similar to other brains. There is the brain of chimpanzee, and there is the brain of Homo sapiens, of Neanderthals, and there are other brains. But we are apparently the only brain that generates new things every day, including this session. So we generate new things using the same physics, but something about the organization of the brain, and we maybe discuss later about what do we know that is unique about us, that might subserve, although we don't know for sure, might subserve the capability to create something new. It's very recent. Everything happened very recent. We are very, very new breed, very new species. And this species started to generate with the same brain that did not change for the last 200,000 years. We are generating new things every day. Cell phones, iPhones, computers, nanotechnology, optics, and so forth. And the question is, what is unique in our brain mechanistically that enables creativity in any field? But we are still far from even understanding what makes us so unique. But we can discuss it later if you will ask me questions about the uniqueness of the human brain. But I'm very far from being able to explain such high-level capabilities as writing a book or making associations or imagery, closing my eyes and image something or remember something that I did many years ago and just on spot bringing it here. We don't really understand these aspects yet. So I have to frustrate you that you are not going to be, by the end of this evening, you are not going to understand yourself.
Yeah. Well, let me say this, this frustration, of course, is very bad, but at the same time, as long as you buy my books, it's okay.
But are there some building blocks or things that we really think are contributing in an essential way to creativity?
Yes, okay, again, my first point, and I think it's an important point. The first point is in the last 200,000 years since the Homo sapiens came to Earth, there are no genetic changes that could explain new phenomena like, let's say, written language or mathematics. So it was there already 200,000 years ago, the structure, but it didn't happen 200,000 years ago, mathematics or writing language or the books of Erudition and so forth. It came recently, and it will come more and more with time. So that's one aspect. We already had this brain as it is 200,000 years ago. There was very small, minute genetic changes during this, but they cannot explain the new creativity that is coming all the time. So that's something that has to be clear. The other thing that has to be clear, that it's not the weight of the brain. So people with bigger brain are not more creative than people with smaller brain. So Einstein's brain was 1.2 kilogram, which is much smaller than any brain here unless we have very small children here. So it's not the size. But so what can it be that is unique to human, as much as we know? We don't have the brain of the Neanderthal. We have the genome of the Neanderthal, which is extremely close to our genome, but apparently he was not creative enough to be able to survive the changes needed to build and to generate fire and to build houses and then to communicate via language and preserve information. Apparently, they disappeared 30,000 years ago. We are the only species, the hominid species, that are left. And this is because, as much as I can see, in terms of brain, is because of several things. First of all, we have a lot of microchips. In our brain, there is 10 to the power of 11, so 100 billion elements, these units that are called nerve cells. And this is much bigger than expected. The number is much bigger than expected from the size of our body as mammals. So we created a larger brain relative to the body size. And this large brain, in terms of number, is certainly makes much more computations, and I'm a computation and neuroscientist, much more computations than other brains that are smaller. So one is smaller in terms of numbers, not smaller in terms of weight, as I said. So that's one aspect. We have a lot of microchips. Each microchip is very heavily connected to others. So it's a connected network. And a state of creativity, or any other state, is a state of the brain which enables something new. So if I'm now fantasizing on something new or have some new idea, it's a new state of the brain. So all these cells together, apparently, because of this communication and heavy interactions, can generate a phenomena in the brain that will be interpreted later as something new, an idea, a relativity theory, or something of that sort. So the number of cells is certainly part of our capability to do new things. That's part of it, but it's not all of it. And we can discuss later other things, but I think the most fundamental things is this number of elements that generate phenomena, also sickness. Any phenomena is this interaction among group of cells, and that together they generate something, either learning something new or generating something new. But why do they generate something new? I can't answer yet. And also, and that's very important, we are apparently today, as much as we know, the most connected between regions in the brain. So there are all these regions that we like to think about as separate elements: vision, audition, movement, emotions, and so forth. We know that our brain is highly connected. So when I feel something, I automatically see something, and I may hear something, just because every information flows very, very, very easily in this brain of ours, which is not the case in chimpanzee, for example. So that's part of being able to integrate from many modalities and generate, for example, language. Language is an example of something that needs many modalities. For example, this glass, when I say the word glass, I mean visual glass, I mean tasty glass, I mean there is also touch. So I'm using a lot of senses, and the monkey cannot generate the notion of glass, which is a very creative notion, that by a few sounds I replicate or I represent something. And this is because of this interaction between regions in the brain.
Idan, you're telling us that our brain evolved in a very complex connected network. You're also saying that more is not better, Einstein's example. And I've seen that there are studies showing that it's probably the capacity of the cortex to optimize itself over time that is linked to optimum or higher creation or cognitive skills. At least they have shown that for some musician and mathematician. So is it really an end stage of optimization? And does that mean that at some point we will be stuck in our creativity?
Okay, so that's a complicated question.
Can I add a question to Stefan's? Your model is machines. You said the three of us are machines. But we're not only machines. We have emotions. And the areas of the brain that enter into action, at least during the creative process, for example, during writing, these areas are determined by and large by our emotions. Do you agree with that? And we have all sorts of emotions. We have some positive ones, we have some negative ones. And the negative ones hinder our capacity, they block our capacity to write on certain topics. I know that there are some topics which are so painful that I have a very hard time writing about them. And when I do, the writing is poor. It's not freed up. How do you combine this with your model of machines? Where does the emotion enter that really functions like a faucet that liberates the flow or blocks it? You see what I mean?
Of course. First of all, we sit in here in Geneva, and I think one of the best, if not the best, group in the world dealing with affective neuroscience, emotional neuroscience, are sitting in Geneva University. These are the people who are trying to understand brain and emotions, also from the mechanistic point of view. So first of all, let me tell you, as a neuroscientist, I told you that I think of us as a physical machine. So emotions, for me, is an emergent of a physical phenomena. The fact that you say, but we have emotions, of course we have emotions, but it doesn't mean that it's not physical.
No, it's translated.
It's translated into a certain behavior, and you are angry, you are sad, you are fearful, and so forth. But and that's very. I know that sometimes when I say it, people really resent
the feeling that physical reality.
That everything is physical. What can I do? What can I do?
True.
You know, what can I do? It's there. I looked at the brain, and I looked at this region, amygdala, and I looked at this other region, and it's only signals, and it's only chemicals. And when you take Prozac, it affects your emotions directly. So it's a physical system. Yep. And when there is some stroke, you lose certain capability to express emotion. So it's physical. So we have to agree on that, yes, because otherwise we cannot progress. In science, I mean, in science. We can progress, of course, and write beautiful books like you do, but in terms of understanding the brain, we have to absolutely assume, unless somebody proves differently, that it's all, absolutely all, and nothing else but material. Okay, so there are genes, and these genes generate muscles, and these genes generate my heart, and these same genes generate my brain. The unique thing about my brain, of course, is the capability to change, that relates to your optimization question, is to change during interaction. Now, which we don't know of any such what we call plastic element. So my muscle is also plastic, so when I train, my muscle becomes stronger, more fibers and so forth. It takes a lot of time. But for your brain and for my brain, just meeting each other once, we did before. I already remember you. I remember most of what we said. So it's an amazing capability to adapt and remember and change physically. Again, it's a physical change memory. It's not something else. It's a physical change memory. And then the question is optimization. Apparently something about our capability to change in real time, on spot. By the way, your comment about not being able to write under what you call negative emotions, which I don't know what you mean exactly, because for me emotions, so the negative thing is coming later on as a decision what is negative or not. So we can discuss the issue of negative, because from negative things, from cruelty and from sorrow and from suffering, beautiful things came out of. But this will be an interesting...
Negative, in my view, is strictly when it blocks you. You can write a lot on... I'm not passing a value judgment on the emotion. It's just the faucet.
It's negative in the sense that it blocks things.
Absolutely. Yeah,
but then you
else.
can use it maybe to create something, because it's part of life, this what is called negative things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think just to end your question, I think we didn't discuss about this particular connection between cells, which is called synapse. And these connections are enable us to change all the time. The quality of the connection, the efficacy of the connection, and even generating new connections. And we know that in terms of this plasticity capability of the brain to react and to optimize the connectivity in real time is very unique. I mean, it happens in any animal. Mouse also learn and chimpanzees also learn. But we have a very unique set of proteins in our synapses, much more developed in evolution than any other connections between cells that we know. And these unique connections that we have in terms of the many, many, many capabilities to generate a flow of information between one cell to the other is very developed in our synapses, so to speak. And that enables us to change so fast and to react to the world so fast, adaptively, and become optimized to what is needed from us at that point. Sometimes, if you don't have too much information bombarding you, which you don't know what to do with. So we have this plastic capability, which is unique in all the kingdom that we know. If you compare synapse by synapse, from elephant to giraffe to monkeys and to rodents, our synapses are much more capable of changing in real time and adapt to what is expected of us. So you put me a computer in front of me as a child, and I need to understand what is expected, doing it extremely fast. You put an iPhone to a brain of a child, tuck, 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 and there is a message sent. It's due to this capability to adapt due to these connections. So we are unique in that sense as well.
Metin, Idan nous amène quand même un paradoxe en nous disant qu'on n'a pas évolué depuis 200 000 ans et pourtant la créativité humaine a explosé depuis 3000 ans.
Mais je ne sais pas ça. Vraiment, je sais. Vraiment, je ne sais pas. J'ai le sentiment qu'on doit rester extrêmement modeste et extrêmement humble en l'espèce. Il y a des exemples. Par exemple, toute la philosophie grecque a été conçue il y a 3000 ans. Et qu'avons-nous fait depuis? On l'a interprété. On l'a mise un petit peu au goût du jour. En matière d'art, je ne suis pas sûr que les expressions contemporaines soient vraiment alors que le iPhone est effectivement dans le domaine scientifique, là il n'y a pas de discussion possible. Le iPhone, l'ordinateur, là les avancées sont spectaculaires. Mais en matière de création artistique, vraiment, je ne suis pas sûr. Hein. Il faut rester... Quand on lit les romanciers russes du 19e, moi, quand je lis Dostoïevski, je n'ai qu'une envie, c'est d'arrêter d'écrire. Parce que, voilà, tout a été fait, tout a été dit, c'est fantastique. Donc, je ne sais pas.
Je me suis mal expliqué.
Dis-moi.
Tu cites l'époque antique autour de l'écriture, de la philosophie. Les Russes, à un moment donné, dans un espace donné. Finalement, est-ce que la créativité, elle n'est pas aussi, pour permettre l'expression, la rencontre dans un espace donné, dans un temps donné? Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas finalement des espaces, des interactions qui, à un moment donné, permettent à un groupe de personnes une explosion de leur créativité, de leur potentialité créative?
Bon, c'est vrai que si l'on songe par exemple à la Florence de la première moitié du XVIe siècle, voilà, par exemple, voilà, Venise, Florence, entre 1500 et 1550, Machiavel va au bistrot, croise Michel-Ange, etc. Enfin, c'est hallucinant. Mais c'était comme ça. C'était un tout petit bourg. Et c'était comme ça. On peut aussi penser effectivement à la Grèce de Périclès.
Les impressionnistes.
On peut penser aux impressionnistes, absolument. On peut penser aussi à ce qui s'est passé en Terre Sainte. Il fut un temps, parce qu'il y a quand même quelque chose de magique dans ce qui s'est passé, dans ce qui a été écrit à cette période. Donc, effectivement, il y a deux points de vue. Il y a un point de vue relatif qui consiste à dire, ma foi, chacune de nos époques a besoin d'expression. Il faut que les artistes puissent s'exprimer à leur manière. C'est un point de vue relatif. Il y a aussi le point de vue absolu qui consiste à dire il y a des standards de beauté qui sont plus élevés que d'autres. Voilà. Et c'est vrai que lorsqu'on s'occupe, par exemple, de l'équilibre d'un amphithéâtre grec, moi j'ai le sentiment que c'est la perfection. Et c'est aussi un travail d'une énorme subtilité. Chacun sait que les colonnes du Parthénon, par exemple, ne sont pas juste des colonnes bing-boum comme ça. Elles sont toutes différentes, elles respectent la règle du nombre d'or. Tout est le résultat d'une très grande précision, d'une très grande subtilité. Donc oui, c'est vrai, chaque époque a ses expressions, mais voilà, je préfère quand même l'amphithéâtre d'Épidore au stade de la Praille.
A question for Idan. You have shown us how creativity is coming from an extremely organized system, this perfect machinery. How come is it then possible that creativity is also so often associated with an imbalance, with mental disorder? Metin has written about two artists that had bipolar disorder, Nietzsche and Van Gogh, and they were probably the most creative at times where they were also the closest from the abyss. How do you explain this paradox?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's true that there are examples of these unique brains suffering sometimes a lot or having these difficulties like bipolar disorders or schizophrenia. You can see sometimes people getting into the Alzheimer period, and then there is a creativity of these people who never started to draw. So there are many examples of a change of a brain, of a unique activity in the brain that is associated with something new. That's true. It's not always the case. There are many creative people without bipolar, as much as I know. And so you don't need this necessarily to be creative, but it's true. And so let me tell you how I think about, as I said, a creative brain, in principle, should be in a state that is a new state of the brain, something that did not appear before. And when I say a state, I really mean activity, electrical activity, so physical activity of a group of cells that are coming into working together at this moment that they did not do before. This new activity, and because we have so many capabilities, so many statistical possibilities, there are many things that I can't even imagine that will happen in terms of combination of activities that will stand for something new. So these diseases, in principle, and when you read about people, creative people, and you ask them, when was the creative idea coming? At what point? You sometimes hear in these books, and I read many books about creative people, telling about their moments of creativity. You see that these are unique moments, even in a normal brain life. So, before going to sleep, when you are a little bit dizzy, or when you have a little fever, not too high, but a little fever is extremely good for creativity. And you could ask me why. Why? Because exactly at these conditions that are in between something, that you lose a little bit control, that you come into a little bit of something that is not completely under, and I'm sure you can ask people that create, what is this moment? It's because the brain is in a new state, or could be in a new state. It's not a repetitive state. And then it could happen that a new idea will come, a bright idea will come. Of course, then you have to systematically work on it and make out of it something that is readable and communicative and so forth. But this moment of insight, this zest moment, this aha moment is a moment of a new state of the brain. And I think that these people that have this bipolar are going to, or take a drug, or LSD, which I don't recommend, but I'm saying that it could bring the brain into a new state. So that's how I see the capability to become something else for a while, and from this you can develop systematically. That's how I see it.
C'est des périodes où on se sent désinhibé, libéré, désinhibé. C'est vrai qu'il y a des collègues à moi qui disent qu'ils aiment bien boire un verre avant de se mettre à écrire, ou 2 verres. Bon, évidemment, personnellement, ça n'est pas possible, ça ne fonctionnerait pas, mais j'ai absolument besoin de me sentir rassuré, et en particulier, non pas tant par l'environnement dans lequel je me trouve, qui m'est assez égal, mais dans l'état psychique dans lequel je me trouve et qui me libère. Donc je crois, c'est effectivement tout à fait juste ce que tu disais, que la dernière année de vie de Van Gogh, c'était quasiment 1 toile par jour. C'était incroyable. Et la dernière année de vie à peu près lucide de Nietzsche, avant les 10 dernières années de folie complète, où il était interné, mais la dernière année, c'est 4 livres. Donc, c'est vrai qu'il y a une sorte de libération qui se fait. Moi, je n'ai pas passé par ces phases, comme l'a si gentiment rappelé, je ne suis pas encore bipolaire, ça viendra, mais j'ai, disons, à mon échelle, je ressens le besoin de me sentir libre d'écrire sur le sujet en question. Et ce sentiment de liberté, il a plusieurs sources. Il y a évidemment le côté psychologique, la peur, l'angoisse de découvrir des domaines qui pourraient raviver des douleurs, me faire de la peine, ça c'est sûr, mais il y a également la question du savoir, la question de la compétence. Et c'est vrai que lorsqu'on n'est pas compétent dans un domaine, ce que l'on écrit est mauvais, c'est lourd. Je me suis trouvé une fois dans une situation où j'avais vraiment un tout petit paragraphe à écrire, c'était dans La fille des Louganis, sur mon personnage principal, Pavlina, qui à un moment donné était couturière et travaillait dans un hôtel. Elle réparait tout ce qui touchait à la literie. Et pour décrire ça, j'avais cherché dans tout Paris, j'ai trouvé finalement une librairie qui avait des livres sur la couture. J'en ai acheté 5, j'ai acheté tout ce que j'ai trouvé, je les ai lus. Et finalement, j'ai réussi non pas à trouver ce que je cherchais, mais à trouver quelque chose qui pouvait s'adapter à mon histoire. Et à partir de là, je l'ai potassé et la plume filait bien. Mais il fallait avoir quand même un niveau de compétence suffisant pour qu'il y ait l'effet libératoire. Alors l'effet libératoire, il peut être dû à une compétence, mais il peut être dû aussi à une absence d'angoisse. Et cette angoisse, elle est mauvaise, elle est négative dans l'écriture.
Si on revient justement à à la particularité de la folie bipolaire, au fond, il y a une surreprésentation d'artistes avec ce trouble. Il y en a vraiment beaucoup, on pourrait en citer énormément. Est-ce qu'au fond, la capacité productive de ces personnes ne vient pas précisément de l'alternance entre, d'une part, l'explosion, le foisonnement, cette espèce de débordement, et en même temps la capacité organisatrice de la dépression, la capacité à ramasser les morceaux et de délivrer et de mettre en sens, de n'être pas que dans le foisonnement et la dispersion?
Je ne sais pas, Stéphane. Moi, je crois que toi, tu es beaucoup mieux placé que moi pour... Mon sentiment, en ayant passé, j'ose le dire, des années avec Van Gogh et Nietzsche, mon sentiment, c'est que dans leur période de créativité maximale, l'un comme l'autre, donc Nietzsche était un philosophe, mais c'était aussi un artiste, c'était aussi un très grand poète, l'un comme l'autre étaient dans des situations dans leur vie, ils vivaient des moments où ils avaient un besoin impératif de communiquer avec autrui. Et ils n'arrivaient pas à communiquer. Ils étaient plongés dans leur solitude et ils ne savaient pas comment se sortir de cet enfer. Et la seule façon qu'ils avaient de s'en sortir, c'était par leur art. C'était pour eux une façon d'être avec le monde. Ouais.
I want just to add something that I think we should also consider. There is the design aspect, the control aspect, the professional aspect, but there is also the aspect of the chance. There are many cases also in science that things were not designed, and so they weren't systematically designed, and suddenly an unexpected something came from the side. Einstein has these cases or some examples of an idea that was just jumped on him undesigned. Saint-Saëns has this piece of a music, it's called the Cat Fugue. And I was looking for a solution, the last accord was missing, and he was searching, and then there was this cat running on the piano. And the cat did the final part so this is a chance. It was there almost, but something has to come from the outside. So I think some aspects of creativity are really not designed. It's coming from the outside, so to speak. The other thing I wanted to mention, at least in my case, if you ask me what are my moments of creativity, it many times came due to interaction with somebody else. it happened a lot in history that people met from different disciplines, and that's why I feel, we can discuss it later, why I feel artists can influence me a lot as a scientist, I'm talking, and vice versa, because they come from a different language, but this interaction with somebody that has different approach to life in some sense, and it's within me. Maybe I could also be an artist if I had chosen, so to speak, to be this, but it's within me and it's blocked, apparently, this creative aspect, and meeting these other people, and you can see even groups of people that are, let's say, the 1905 and 1907, when Einstein did his miracle year, and 2 years later Picasso did, actually started the whole new movement of art. It came on the same time because these people influence in some indirect way each other, and this merging of the two cultures, so to speak, as C.P. Snow called it. These two cultures coming together may generate something on the friction between the two things that could not be created within each culture on its own. So it's both a chance, but also interaction between different aspects of the humanity that can really encourage creativity in each of the respective fields. That's how I see it today.
Idan, you insist on this core aspect of mental imagery.
Right.
And indeed, often you hear that, for example, in individuals with autism that solve mathematical problems, and they say that they didn't calculate it, they just saw it. Do we have any understanding about this mechanism?
Well, that's actually you closer to your field than mine, but it's true that, you know, when you go to these prehistoric caves in France, south of France, or Altamira in north of Spain, you suddenly realize that these people were the first actually ever to be able to mentalize, let's say, a bison or a horse, then going many miles inside without the bison, without the horse, just with the memory. Mm-hmm. And then being able, which is really unique to the human being, we don't know of any other animal that can take a memory and then physically replicate, so to speak, the memory on a canvas or on the ceiling. This is a unique capability of humans, to be able not only to remember, but to physically, by movement, reconstruct the memory, or by building a sculpture, but without having the figure in front of them. That's very, very unique to the human being. I don't understand the mechanism. We understand a lot about memory, but how do you recruit memory for your own purposes? The whole notions of retrieving memory. I know how to embed memory, but I don't know how then to approach this memory at will, so to speak, at will. I'm going to the cave, and at will, I'm starting to think of bison, and then I'm drawing it, and then I see that this bison is really fitting my memory of the outside bison. This is very, very unique capability of the human being, which is used a lot, of course, in any creative process. Your memory, your references that are there, and you extract it again from your brain at will. That's quite an amazing thing. It's very hard for me even to understand the notion of at will, because I don't believe in free will, because I'm a machine. So how can a machine have even a free will? So that's another issue for another time to discuss, volition, free will. But I'm saying at will, I'm going to the cave, I succeed to create something that I saw before, I compare it, and I'm satisfied. And by the way, Picasso, this relates to your comment before, Picasso thought that they are better artists than him, the Lascaux people, so to speak. And so in that sense, they already were great artists 30,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago.
Dans l'exemple d'Idan, il y a ces hommes préhistoriques qui voient les choses dehors, retournent au fond d'une caverne et de mémoire repeignent. Il y a aussi la notion de synthèse.
En fait, tous les artistes dont nous avons cité les noms, tous les grands artistes, avaient eux-mêmes des modèles, avaient eux-mêmes des références. Van Gogh avait ses références. C'était par exemple les estampes japonaises, mais c'était aussi Millet, Delacroix. Il a passé beaucoup de temps à copier. Et du reste, dans la grande tradition classique, on copiait beaucoup pour apprendre le métier, n'est-ce pas? C'était la dimension artisanale de l'art est une chose qu'il ne faut jamais négliger, elle est essentielle. Et chacun avait ses références. Nietzsche avait lui-même ses références. Donc c'est vrai aussi que il y a, comme tu le dis, le hasard qui joue un rôle dans la vie, il joue un rôle dans nos vies à tous. Et le hasard de rencontrer quelqu'un, ça vaut pour le couple, et le hasard de croiser l'œuvre de notre artiste, ça vaut aussi pour l'artiste. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qu'on ne peut absolument pas, et il ne faut pas. Je veux dire, c'est ce qui fait la beauté aussi de la chose, c'est que, voilà, c'est la vie.
Idan, you spoke before about substances. There was Rimbaud, Baudelaire with hashish, Andy Warhol with LSD, and others. Recent studies have shown that just taking magic mushrooms or LSD could change the functioning and the connectivity of your brain in a very durable way. Those same researchers have also shown that it seems to act on a cognitive mechanism that increases a sense of openness. Is openness something key in creativity? Is there something particular going on in your perspective?
You see, you ask me questions that are beyond. So you see, what we are trying as a basic as you mentioned before, I'm really fundamental basic neuroscientists, and I'm trying to understand the mechanism underlying a phenomena. And there is still in neuroscience, and I said we don't know a lot, there is a big jump between my description today and I think for many years to come, my mechanistic description and a phenomena that emerged from this, let's say the notion of openness. You know, how will I explain it? I can't even see exactly how to do it, not today. How will I explain it based on synapses and neurons and region in the brain? You know, it's a little bit different language, you know, this cognitive language, which is of course essential because eventually we are behaving and we feel and we are cognitive creatures, but how to make the connection between these fundamental things that we are learning very fast to understand, including diseases, and the emergent phenomena, as we call it in physics, the emergent phenomena of a feeling of openness, of a feeling of creativity, this moment, we are so far from understanding that I don't even dare to tell you something intelligent, because I cannot. I will be a little fool to start to try to say something about this connection. So I can't, it's not my language. My language is synapses, is neurons, is spikes, is chemicals, but it's hard for me to jump to this other as yet. It will come, but give me some time.
So cognitive neuroscience tend to believe that we can increase the recruitment, the size of the networks, or the complexity of the networks that are involved in an activity. Mm-hmm. And how can you explain us that a single experience, taking magic mushrooms, can do that?
You know, there is something that we don't understand. There is this what is called the one-shot memory. So let's say that you have a trauma, a car accident, once. You probably will never forget this. You don't need to repeat it many times, once. And it means that at this one occasion, which was extremely important in terms of survival, it is, you know, fatal, it could be fatal. This one occasion is embedded immediately. I mean, within seconds, a whole network has changed physically, and this network will always tend to be reactivated with small associations, will bring you back to this, you know, and you can go to a life of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, to try to really, you know, slow down this strong connectivity that was built on this one occasion. So I would assume that, if you take particular drugs that, on spot are activating a large network that was not activated before and becomes important for some reason. It has to be important in some sense for this to be remembered. It has to be vital for the organism to need to remember it for the future. It could also destroy, of course, the whole brain because you're stuck in repeating this again and again, this once terrible event. And then you can go, but I can see the mechanism. There is a mechanism in the brain, these fast-changing synapses that will recruit a whole network to treat this strong experience. So I think we start to understand that. You can see it in mouse. You can take a mouse. We have a professor at the Hebrew University. You can take a mouse for a few minutes, just swimming in a place without a lever. So the mouse very fast realizes that he's going to drown. Very fast. He knows that there is no way to... And this is a traumatic mouse. After 4 minutes, all his life, he will be traumatic. You can see that he tends not to interact well. It was a trauma already for this little mouse with a much smaller brain because it was a life-threatening, and we are trying to understand the mechanism. What happened to this mouse? And we are starting to understand why these 4 minutes of almost dying changed completely the connectivity in the brain of this mouse forever. Forever. How to unlock this connectivity and to bring this mouse or a traumatic person back to, that's a question. But I can see the mechanism there.
Time is moving on, and I think we should take some questions from the audience. Une question pour Idan ou Metin. Il y a plusieurs personnes qui souhaitent intervenir.
Thank you. It's really fascinating. Bouncing off of what you just said about trauma, now there's proof that DNA is even changing with trauma. Is there any knowledge about how creativity is changed after trauma?
Creativity, how creativity changed after the trauma?
Or resilience, or on the contrary, are people becoming more creative after a trauma because resilience is increasing it, or on the contrary, we see that there's a sort of closing up after it?
So at least in terms of mouse, you can see that this mouse that I mentioned before, you can speak about creative mouse. There are mice that are much more creative than others. They really succeed to explore the maze much better, and they can find the cheese easier than others. So we can try to explore at least creativity in mouse in terms of brain research, because we're not going to open the brain of a creative person and see what happens to the synapses there. But we can ask, but if you traumatize a mice, it's clear that he's now absolutely repeating what he knows to do. He doesn't tend to explore something new. He becomes insecure and repeats itself a lot. This is, by the way, what happens to many of our politicians in Israel, because you see they are repeating a trauma again and again, and they are exactly like the mice. They don't come with new ideas. They are traumatized, and they are trying to traumatize ourselves as well. But that's another issue. Yeah? But they are not creative. It's clear that they are not creative. They are not coming with new ideas. There is a lot of creativity in Israel, a lot of interesting startups, but not in politics. So they are under trauma, and these mouse are under trauma, and trauma is absolutely against creativity.
Yes.
Professor Segev, I want to thank you as a Zen master because you confirmed two things I teach my disciples. The first thing is that psychic experience is nothing more than material interaction. And the second thing, that free will is an illusion. But I was surprised by something you said surprised you, and that is the infinite creativity of the same basic brain structure that we've had for hundreds of thousands of years. Personally, I'm not surprised because, as you cited, I think it was neurons that you were referring to, 10 to the 11th million neurons. Now, when you consider the chessboard has 64 squares, I think, which is a very much smaller number, after only 5 moves, the two players have opened the door to the complexity of more than 1 million. And another example of the same thing is, if Mr. Auditi had studied physics in the 15th century, he could have learned everything necessary to talk with the best people in the field in a few weeks. But today, young people have to study for 20 years before they even have the possibility of understanding the problem, much less the solution. Finally, I just wanted to suggest on the very question tonight of creativity, I teach my disciples that you can improve the environment for creativity by doing these very simple things. First of all, collect all the information necessary to the situation or the problem that you must deal with. Then, do nothing that's vaguely similar to that problem. Go do some gardening, go swimming, go dancing, and wait to see what happens. The less you bother your subconscious mind, the more chance you're going to get a feedback. I call it the Eureka movement.
Absolutely. I agree with every word that you said completely. Thank you very much. No, but I think you touch on a very important issue, and this is something that we all should bother. What are the conditions for each one of us? And they may be different. You know, Virginia Woolf spoke about a room for one myself. She needs a room, a place, this place. And what is the place for each one of us where whatever there is there, which you don't know, and also I agree with you that a lot is subconscious, a lot of things are happening below what I can report, and that's the question. And I'm asking this all my life. Where will I be the most creative? Will it be in the Verbier Musical Festival, or will it be in the swimming pool at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem? Where will it be the time when something will link new to my brain? I have no answer, but I'm seeking at least.
Yeah. It also depends who is in the swimming pool. I think she has a question.
Hi, I have a question for Edan. I'm a neuroscientist, I must say. I think one thing that didn't really bring you very close together is because you didn't say anything about the process of creativity in science and intuition. So how does that fit?
Okay, that's very good. Yes, you're right. Of course, there is a lot of creativity in neuroscience, and I didn't speak about that. I was not asked to speak about that, but now that you ask, sorry? In all science, yeah, in all science. First of all, it's a very recent discipline, as you know. It's a new creation of the human brain, the whole discipline of science. The fact that you can do systematic work, and then you can publish it, and somebody else can repeat it. So it's supposed to be objective behind you and so forth. It's a new invention of the human being, which is a wonderful invention. As we know, there was no electricity here without science and so forth. But about intuition, what is this intuitive moment where I connect things and I feel that that's correct much before I proved it? I already know that this is the direction and this is correct somehow. You speak about mathematicians, they know the proof much before they went through the process of systematic proving it. As I said before, these are exactly this, what I call the aha, or the intuition moment. I don't know to say anything mechanistically about it. Really not. I can't connect today what I know about the brain to this special high-level moments of creativity or intuition. I really can't say anything scientifically today. from my perspective. There are scientists that look at the brain. You can image the brain during a process of creativity. You can say this region is now active or together, but it doesn't give me the mechanism. It's a description from the outside, and I'm looking for the mechanistic aspect. So I can't answer this question, unfortunately. I wish I could.
Metin, un comment?
Oui, moi je crois que l'intuition, c'est quand même beaucoup une question d'expérience. C'est les expériences vécues dans le passé qui nous permettent d'avoir un certain nombre de points de référence sur lesquels on se retrouve automatiquement, volendo nolendo. Et c'est ça, l'intuition. Ça se retrouve dans toutes sortes de situations. Moi, je crois que ce qui est quand même très important quand on parle de créativité et de neurosciences, c'est important évidemment d'essayer de comprendre les mécanismes. Ça, c'est vrai, c'est ce qu'on essaye de faire. C'est très difficile. Il y a des grands scientifiques comme Idan, comme vous. C'est votre travail. Moi, je crois que c'est quand même important de souligner que ce qui compte le plus, c'est quand même la créativité elle-même. Et c'est-à-dire que les chemins qui mènent à la créativité passent aussi par le grand travail et l'humilité. Apprendre le métier, c'est une réalité. Picasso dessinait des femmes n'importe comment, mais il savait dessiner aussi bien que Michel-Ange. Et en matière d'écriture, on peut avoir toutes sortes d'expressions très originales, très créatives et tout ça. Mais le métier, c'est quelque chose qui s'apprend. L'artisanat est une composante essentielle de l'art, c'est la composante majeure de l'art. Et c'est vrai que ce qui compte dans une société, c'est quand même la production artistique, créative, qui nous permet de vivre, qui nous permet de, ce que tu disais avant, qui permet à chaque génération de se connaître, de se regarder, de se retrouver. Et cette démarche-là, elle est quand même largement fondée sur le savoir-faire, durement acquis.
Si vous permettez. I'd like to rebound on the question of intuition and go a step further, perhaps, to inspiration. Because Metin Arditi, before he is blocked, he has had to find a subject, a new book. You need to have found that first, and only then you will feel that you are blocked or not. So how do you get your subject first? How does it come?
It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. It takes about, every time, just about 6 months to get a story straight. And a number of books black with my writing. And a number of errors that I have to correct every time. And at the end of this, typically, writing a book is 6 months preparation, 12 months writing, and 6 months rewriting. And the first 6 months, you end up with something very simple. And say, for God's sake, how did it take me 6 months to do that? Because it's something you can say in 5 minutes. Well, I don't think there is such a thing as inspiration. I think it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of love also for what you do. I love to be in my stories. I love to imagine characters. I love to see them in front of me move and do whatever they want to do because they decide, I don't. Just try to keep up with them. And I think that at the end of this process, you can end up with a more or less decent story to tell and write and get published. But it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, and a lot of humility. I remember I once saw an interview by an American writer of detective stories. I don't remember his name. James Lee Burke. James Lee Burke. I think he lives in Louisiana. And he said, when you're dealing with art, humility is not a virtue. It's a necessity. And I keep getting back to that. And the end result, in the best of all cases, at the end you have a nice story and you can tell yourself that this is creativity, that you've created something. But in reality, you've done a lot of work and you end up with something more or less decent to tell people around you who will buy the book.
I just wanted to add, there is a repeating theme that you said it already twice, and I remember a story by a neuroscientist, Rodolfo Inas, very well-known neuroscientist who knew Marquez very well, Marquez. And this Marquez told him, and you are speaking the same language, that Marquez, I don't know if you know, but he was going through 7 doors. He locked himself, when he was writing, he locked himself in an isolated, completely soundproof, disconnected world. And in this world, he created his creatures, his humans, his people, and he saw them physically. And he was interacting with them. They fought physically. And he said that if somebody would look from the outside about what happened in this room, they will put him in hospital because he was completely crazy, interacting with somebody that is there but nobody else beside him see. And you also mentioned that there are these, you told me already in the first meeting, that there are these creatures, that there are these people that you created, but they talk to you, as if there is you and there is them, although it all happens in your brain, yes? So from the brain point of view, it's interesting that you disconnect yourself from the heroes that you create yourself.
I can tell you a real story. Je le dirai en français, c'est plus simple. Lorsque j'ai passé à un moment donné de l'essai, j'ai commencé par écrire des essais au roman. Donc j'étais à mon premier roman, ça s'appelait Victoria Hall, et il y avait un personnage, une petite dame italienne, âgée, toute frêle, les cheveux blancs, un peu dépressive, qui s'appelait Livia. C'est un personnage du roman. Et j'étais en train d'écrire ce roman, et un soir, je vais me coucher, ça devait être 11h30, je cessais d'écrire, je vais me coucher, je vais au lit, et tout à coup, je comprends, j'arrivais vers la fin de l'écriture du roman, et je comprends que ce personnage, ou en tout cas, si pas je comprends, je crois que ce personnage, eh bien, je vais le perdre. Et je me mets à pleurer dans mon lit, comme si j'allais perdre un être de chair. Ça ne s'est pas reproduit parce que j'ai appris 2 choses. La première, c'est que ces personnages restent toujours en moi. Et puis la deuxième, c'est que la fin de l'écriture n'était pas si proche parce que ça prend beaucoup de temps pour arriver à finir un roman, et beaucoup plus que ce que je pensais, beaucoup plus de réécriture que ce que je pensais. Donc à la fin du compte, on a du temps pour préparer les adieux, n'est-ce pas? C'est pas si...
Ce d'autant plus que dans tes romans, tu as tendance à reconvoquer des personnages.
Oui, toujours. Oui, c'est vrai. Et je le fais, oui, en fait, c'est moi, c'est eux qui viennent, on ne sait pas trop, on essaye de s'entendre.
I would like to turn to Idan for a question how he would look on inspiration, because I have testimonies from physicists, quantum physicist Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who was invited to have a dialogue with Indian masters, and they asked him questions, and he said it was very embarrassing the way they asked questions and the questions they asked, showed me that they knew 10, 100 or 1,000 times more things than I knew, and they just wanted to know where Western physics or science was at. They knew much more. And how do they come to their knowledge? Well, they go into deep meditation and have access, as they say, to all the entities in the universe, and so they know much more. Now, there are people in quantum physics who have tried to look at that. And also are studying the brain. What would you tell us about the microtubulines and the researches of Penrose and Hameroff, how these microtubules in our brain, 40 times per second, they ignite and go back, etc. And they could connect with what Plato has called the world of ideas. So that would mean there is a world with many ideas, or with all possible ideas, and you can connect to it if your brain or your mind is in a state to do so.
Idan, your word?
Much too mystical for me. Much too mystical for me. I don't believe in worlds of ideas outside myself. I generate the word. I mean we, yes? Our brain generates God. Our brain generates the ideas. There are no ideas there. I may pick up idea by discussing it with you, but it's not from outside. It's so that's my view of as a scientist, of course. So that's
you did not look at their researches of Penrose and Hameroff?
So okay, now about Penrose. Penrose is a great physicist. He's a great physicist, no question. He did wonderful work in physics. But what he said about these microtubules and the involvement of quantum physics into consciousness and things that he's tried is absolutely nonsense.
I don't agree.
Thank you.
I gave the microphone.
J'aimerais, Idan et Metin, donner le mot de la fin à Yves Flukiger, qui nous a si gentiment accueillis.
Mesdames et messieurs, ce serait très bref. Au nom de l'Université hébraïque de Jérusalem, au nom de l'Université de Genève, j'aimerais remercier nos deux conférenciers pour le magnifique dialogue qu'ils nous ont offert ce soir. Cette rencontre improbable, a priori, a donné lieu à toute une série de réflexions sur la créativité. Comme vous le savez, pour l'Université hébraïque de Jérusalem, dont je salue le recteur ce soir, et pour l'Université de Genève, la créativité fait manifestement partie de notre mission. C'est le centre de notre devoir par rapport à l'ensemble de la société. Et je remercie vraiment ces deux brillants esprits de nous avoir ouvert toute une série de pistes de réflexion extrêmement intéressantes pour mieux comprendre cette créativité. J'aimerais aussi dire que pour l'Université hébraïque de Jérusalem et pour l'Université de Genève, la polyvalence est une caractéristique tout à fait importante, centrale de nos développements, de nos institutions universitaires. Et cette polyvalence, elle a été parfaitement représentée ce soir par la neurobiologie et par l'art, l'écriture, représentée par nos deux brillants conférenciers. Je les en remercie parce que c'est la démonstration que la polyvalence est absolument indispensable aussi pour cette créativité. Puis finalement, j'aimerais terminer par vous dire que l'événement qui a été organisé ce soir en collaboration avec l'Université hébraïque de Jérusalem est simplement le premier pas d'une collaboration que nous allons étendre dans les années à venir. Nous allons signer ce soir même un accord de partenariat stratégique entre nos deux universités. Donc l'événement que vous avez eu la chance de suivre ce soir, il va se répéter encore à l'avenir. Et puis je pense que la prochaine fois, on aura l'occasion d'aller à l'auditoire U600 pour que vous puissiez être tous et toutes accueillis dans les meilleures conditions possibles. Merci beaucoup, très bonne soirée.